And record. And I think that's all the technological pieces. So, welcome to Jesus 101. I believe this is episode 4. And today we are talking about miracles. So, as we know in the Gospels, there's a number of times where Jesus is recorded as doing various miraculous acts. So we'll talk a little bit about how we understand those things and a little bit about maybe dive into some of the miracles themselves and kind of unpack them a little bit. And as always, I am Reverend Katie Cuthill from First Presbyterian Beach Street Church or Missing Piece, whichever of those areas you know me from. And live so far, we're joined by Reverend Steve Heath. But I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, as Katie said, I'm Steve Heath, and I am a member at First Presbyterian Church. I'm myself a retired United Church of Christ minister, and I'm presently in the process of relocating from Florida back to my home state of Tennessee. Uh, but I'm happy to be here this evening.
Me, I'm happy you're here too, Steve. So thanks for joining us, and welcome to anybody who's watching on Facebook Live, and anybody that would like to see the other episodes of Jesus 101 that have already been recorded. Those are available on the YouTube page of First Presbyterian Daytona Beach. Oh, we have another joiner, so we'll let them come on into the room. So, Steve, first, I kind of wanted to think a little bit as we've sort of progressed through the other episodes of Jesus 101. We've talked a little bit about the context and kind of how we understand these bits of scripture, because for many of us and for many faith traditions, it's a very literal interpretation. Or I don't know about for you, but for me as a kid, the stories of Jesus were often held in similarity to fairy tales. It was like, oh, well, Santa Claus is real, Easter Bunny's real, the Billy Goat's Gruff, sure, why not? The Wicked Witch, why not? And so is Jesus. Okay, cool. So Jesus can do magic, right? And so, of course, that's really neat, and that fits in with how I understand things as a child. But
Right.
hopefully, we grow up beyond that level of understanding and begin to mature into some other levels of understanding who this Jesus person is. And brief recap. So we talked about in the beginning, we talked about Jesus's birth narrative and how we understand that engaged with the Genesis narrative and the different ways that the Gospels unpack it. We've talked about some parables and how to understand those and kind of how Jesus used those to teach. And so today we'll talk a little bit about the miracles that Jesus performed.
Mhm.
So, and I think one of the things that's important to remember is about timing. So, when Jesus was living, breathing, moving, walking amongst us, which I don't think is a super debatable fact, he's one of the most well documented humans in history. So we'll just assume that we all agree on that Jesus actually existed. But there would have been a very different understanding of illness, of the various kinds of events that Jesus might have run into. So, to be more clear, there was a number of times when Jesus ran into somebody who was possessed, who had demons. And we're told stories in several occasions that Jesus would exorcise these demons effectively, that would ask them to leave. And often, interestingly, the demons would recognize Jesus. So that's kind of a side note. But I think it's worthy of mention that, and you can tell me what you think about this, Steve, that there are things then that might have been called demons that now we might call mental illness. Do you think that that's accurate?
Yes, I mean, I'm confident that it is. They certainly didn't understand psychology, or it was a pre-scientific time, as I've heard it described, and so I think that's true. That there were, even just the descriptions of how the people behaved, like it sounds like mental illness. It would certainly be labeled as that today.
Mm.
And I think that is indeed the case that they didn't understand. Well, they understood a lot of things, but yeah, the idea that lots of illness, both mental and physical, was attributed to the demonic. And as I've said before, uh, the thing that I will affirm in that belief is that means it's not from God.
Mm.
Yeah, but
Oh, I like the
that
way you said that. Yeah, thanks.
yeah. Hmm.
So, and when I think about that, then that doesn't necessarily need to exclude the possibility of uh, more traditional understandings of possession or sort of demonic activity, but it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily mean that that's all that was happening. Is that, am I interpreting that accurately, you think?
Yeah. I mean, there. Oh, I mean, when we talk about the whole realm of what we call the supernatural, uh, yeah, there's more to it than I don't claim to know all about it, and there are things that for which there's no explanation that we can offer that still happen today, and it does seem to happen more among in cultures that we think of as more primitive than ours, uh, more frequently. But yeah, I don't think that I don't think that everything can be explained necessarily in purely psychological terms.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't. But
Yeah.
yet, when we talk about demons, angels, all of that, it's sort of a realm that I don't feel it. I don't feel confident that anyone should be too sure about themselves when it comes to their understanding, including me.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. And I think um, part of what I'm hoping we sort of unpack together, both today, but also throughout this series, is sort of dismantling the either or thinking. Like it either
Yeah.
has to be totally one thing or totally the other. And I just don't think that that's the truth. I think, in fact, part of the beauty of scripture and the gospel and the life of Jesus is that it is something we can continue to study and continues to reveal itself and open up to us in new and different ways. And I think where us religious folk sometimes get ourselves in trouble is whatever we're currently believing as the most true to us, we then say this is the truth and the only truth.
Yeah.
And anybody who thinks anything different is wrong.
Yes. Correct.
We got a bad rap for that.
Deservedly, in many cases.
Yeah. Yeah. So I also think so context would have been important. Some of what was possible and impossible in the minds of these ancient folks, and possible and impossible in the minds of us. Even the words we use to diagnose things. So that gives us some um, ability to hold these things a little differently, a little more loosely. But I'm curious about too, sort of the symbolic meanings. And this is one of those things that I think sometimes becomes an either or. Like, is there a literal case of a literal human with a literal dysfunction of some description, whom then a literal Jesus comes to and says, be gone, demons, and they're gone? Or, and I'm intentionally making it an either or, so we can wander a bit. Or is this some symbolic gesture of like, if we are willing to release these things, or we can learn from the idea that we are burdened by things that Jesus can release us from? I mean, do you lean towards one of those or the other, Steve, or do you feel like that's a place we wander or get ourselves in trouble?
Uh, all the above. Uh, yeah, for me, the whole point of reading scripture is to see what it's saying to me, to us. Now, to understand that, I think you do need to understand or think about or try to understand what did it mean to the original audience? What did it mean then? What would it have been assumed it would mean to those people when it was written? Nevertheless, uh, I, I use I use the analogy of the Bible as a window to God. I'm looking at a window at the moment, and if I focus on the window itself, if I focus on the actual window that I'm looking at, I suddenly start to see specks of dirt and dust. And I bet if I looked long enough, I might even see some imperfection in the window, perhaps. But that's not the point. The point is not to look at the window. It is to look through the window to see what is on the other side. Otherwise, there's no point in the window even being there. It's not a work of art. It's a window. I think of the Bible that way. That I think of it as a window to God. And if I just look at Scripture, which I have spent a whole lot of time doing and enjoy doing, but if I only focus on it, I will find things that like, well, wait, it says this here. And people say there are no contradictions, but well, then I must not be able to understand plain language because it says something different over here. Uh, Things like that, that I will find specks of dirt. Uh,
Mm.
but if I try rather, but if I ask myself, but what am I seeing? What is that showing me about God? That's a whole different matter. And I think it does say a lot to us about God. So, to answer, using that analogy to answer your question, well, when I look at the miracle stories, what matters most to me is okay, but what does that mean for me? Does that mean that, you know, I don't expect to see Jesus walking on water over to my fishing boat, you know. Uh, but then again, if I were fishing in a boat and there were a storm, would I pray? Certainly. And would I seek God's presence? Certainly. And God is present with me then too. So, but see, now I'm already getting into the meaning of the story rather than the literal, it had to, if it had to happen that way, does that mean it still has to happen that way? Or is there a broader meaning for the story?
I
I've
really
heard.
appreciate the way you're beginning to unpack this, Steve, because it's what's becoming clear to me is that if this story of Jesus is
Mm-hmm.
entirely meant to be literal historical fact, there's no room for me in it.
Right.
I don't need a book
Exactly.
like that.
Exactly. I don't need to, unless I happen to ever be in a storm on the Sea of Galilee, then how's the story going to help me very much? Uh, but it's the meaning behind it. And I cannot help but believe that when it was first written, it was not so that people would say, "Oh, well, if we ever happen to be on a ship, on the Sea of Galilee in a storm." Uh, no, I think that it was understood then that it would have broader implication and broader meaning for the people that were reading it then too. Otherwise, it just doesn't seem that it would have been much point in the writing of it. If it was, they didn't even think of history itself the way we think of history. Uh, the factual, what we think of as being like factual versus non-factual is even that is a relatively modern distinction. I think the Enlightenment. Is I was taught fundamentalism is a reaction, or rather, fundamentalism is a response to the Enlightenment. That without the Enlightenment, there wouldn't be such a thing as fundamentalism. And it's sort of letting science, well, I don't want to get too deep here in what I'm saying, but that until the Enlightenment came along, those distinctions, oh, but did that really happen exactly that way, was not really an important question, even in the minds of people. Uh,
Yeah. And I love that you brought up the Enlightenment and the way it attempts to call us into a singular truth and factual kind of agreement on things. I'm currently reading Barbara Brown Taylor's "Learning to Walk in the Dark," and she talks about an endarkening in
Mhm.
contrast to an enlightenment that invites us back into mystery, back into the I
Yeah.
don't know, back into the there
Yeah.
is not a singular truth about these events or about much of anything. Uh,
Hmm.
there's only sort of an as it has been revealed to me to this point, and again the beauty in that it can continue to reveal itself. I'd love to pull out a particular miracle story. Maybe we'll get to a couple of them. But the first miracle that's recorded, I'm pretty sure Luke, is where Jesus turns water into wine at a wedding.
Hmm.
And, basically, very, very brief, the gospel according to Katie, which we all know is quite flawed. Um, basically, there's a big wedding, it's a big celebration, expectations of good food and good wine, and many of the things that you might expect of a wedding today. But the wine starts to run out, and Jesus's mom, Mary, says, "Son, I want you to make some more wine." And I think Jesus at first is kind of like, "No, no, no. That's not what I'm here to do right now." And anyway, he ends up doing it anyway, and it turns out that it's the best wine, so that the guests are like, "Oh, why did you save the best wine for the last? You should serve that
Yeah.
first," and etc.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so as a child, again, this was evidence of Jesus's magic, which made it very confusing to me as a young person of how I was supposed to try to be like Jesus if Jesus had magic, because I didn't.
Right.
Trust
Exactly.
me, I tried.
Yeah.
Um, So how do we understand these kinds of things? Do you start to think about, was there some kind of magic? Was there some kind of miraculous?
Yeah. Okay. So this past week I saw a meme on Facebook, and it was I guess the labels were wrong in a looked like a Walmart maybe, but it was clearly the wine section. But the sign above it said water, and the meme said Jesus has been here. But uh, okay, I can only speak for me on this. Okay, so when I hear that story, that seems so. What was Jesus just showing off? I mean, if that really happened, well, was that just Jesus showing off? I mean, it's like really. So if I run short, if I didn't get enough wine for the party that I'm throwing, I can just pray and say, well, Lord, we need more wine. Uh, I'm going to fill up some, jugs of water and count on you to turn it into wine. Uh, was it just to show that Jesus was divine and could do anything that he pleased? I just have issues with that whole showing off thing about it, and I kind of, when you say what happened, well, I tend to want to say it's just a story. But now, when I say it's just a story, even that is being too either or. There is a say I'm told that there is a tribe in a certain tribe of Native American culture that there's a saying that a person, when they're getting ready to tell a story, will say, "Now this may not have happened exactly like this, but this story is still true."
Mm.
You know, and again, we're back into what is truth. Is scientific truth the only truth? Is historical truth the only truth? Is that story true? Yeah, that story is true because it's full of truth. Now, did it really happen exactly the way the gospel writer said it happened? Or was the gospel writer trying to convey some things about Jesus and maybe believed it to have happened because had heard it and that it sort of arose as a thing that happened? Maybe something similar happened, but gosh, I have no idea.
Yeah.
And if you want to believe that he really turned water into wine, uh, okay, fine. But now, how does that apply to your life? It's still the question for me. If you okay, how is holding on to that belief helping you to live a more fulfilled life, a life more in keeping with God's will for you?
Yeah.
And I think that's a good question to ask ourselves about that story. Yeah. Uh, okay. So, uh, like for me, well, uh, Jesus does make things better and not necessarily great, uh, but a life with Him is more uh, enriching and fulfilling than one without Him. Uh, you know, I heard that a child once said that the point of the story was that if you're going to have a wedding, it's a good idea to have Jesus there. Uh, uh, it is one of the tougher stories, though, I have to say, in my mind,
Mhm.
uh, of that that miracle story.
Yeah. Well, and it
Um,
invites us into themes of abundance, which I think is useful
yeah,
versus, themes of scarcity. There's not enough, there's never enough.
right, right.
Where I find it sticky is when I hear folks start to apply it to their life as, just sort of pray for anything you want and you get it. And
Yeah,
that, like
yeah,
that's how Jesus works. Um,
yeah,
and often I will hear out of those same kinds of voices things like, I'm blessed. I'm blessed. And it becomes this almost transactional sense of, well, I have enough faith to say
mhm,
the right prayer to get what I want. So, and therefore
yeah,
I'm blessed. And that equation, when you go out and then try to apply it to somebody who doesn't have enough, then implies that they didn't pray the right prayer, that they did something wrong, basically,
yeah,
right? Or else they'd
right.
be less like me. And so that's where I feel like is a space to kind of open that up a little bit from what I hear some of my um, other people who have my profession, uh, as it begins to become sort of a prosperity message instead of it being a message about care and abundance and love and the way that sort of the kingdom works. I think Jesus was always
Yeah,
trying to talk about the kingdom of God and how it can work if we all live in accordance with the teachings of Jesus, with the teachings of the law.
yeah, right. I think that the story is in and of itself a metaphor about Jesus. And by that I mean that he is the best wine, which came last. And which is not to say the other wine wasn't good, you know. And but that I think the gospel writer, the evangelist, to use the technical term that we learned in seminary to use, I think the evangelist was trying to make the point that that Jesus was himself the best wine that God had saved for last. Uh, that's what I think about that story.
And I love the way you've couched that, and I love the way this story can grow with us because again, as a child, it was Jesus powers, right? By the time
Yeah,
I was in college or a little bit after that, and I had become exposed to wine and on occasion too much wine. I don't think that's unique to me, but there was this idea that wait a second, these people were just so drunk they didn't know what it was at that point,
not
right? And hey, hold on. What do you need after
good.
several glasses of wine? If you've had too much, you need some daggone water. So maybe, you know, this doesn't have to be miraculous at all. It's just you get what you need, and what they actually needed was a sip of water.
And when you read that story carefully, and I'll admit that I'm just going from memory. I don't have the text in front of me, but uh, it isn't that Mary exactly said, "Jesus, go turn some of this water into wine." It was she came to Jesus with the problem. They don't have wine. they've run out of wine. And basically, Jesus' answer was sort of, well, what do you want me to do about it? And she didn't say do that. She said to the host, whatever he tells you to do, just do whatever he says. That was what she said.
Right.
And so then Jesus says, okay, get some jugs, get some of these jugs, fill them with water. And so, I think there's that in there. Just what, do what he says. Just do what he said and trust that it's going to work. As you said, abundance. It becomes then about abundance. You know, j- just do what Jesus says, uh, and go by that, and see what happens, and live by. It's sort of about living by faith then. And lo and behold, it turned out there was plenty of wine, and it was not only enough; it was the best. Uh, Again, did that really happen just that way? Well, again, well, I wasn't there. I can't say it did or didn't. Uh, I have my doubts, but I don't have my doubts that if I follow the teachings of Jesus, if I try to live my life by the Sermon on the Mount, and try to be the kind of person that Jesus was, the more I try to do that, do whatever I learned from him, yeah, things have a way of when I say working out, I don't mean I get more money and all that, but life is, wine was about enjoying life and about finding, joy. So there is more joy in the life where I do what he says. That's that I would affirm.
Yeah, I'm
Whether
gonna
he
point
literally
that out.
turned, and you may have heard the preacher story that says, "Do you believe it?" Someone asked this fellow if he believed that Jesus turned water into wine, and the guy said, "Well, I really don't know, but in my house, he turned wine into groceries because the guy had been an alcoholic."
Uh,
You know? So you know,
yeah, so a deeper story about
yeah,
transformation.
exactly. Just the transformation about change to something better.
Hmm. Another story that I has continued to unfold for me in my life is the loaves and fishes. So again, the very
Mhm.
abbreviated,
Yeah.
not very accurate Katie version. Thousands of people are gathered and they're listening to Jesus teach, and they have nothing to eat. And there's talk about going into town to get something to eat, but how are we going to feed all these people? And a boy comes up and he's got, depending on which version you read, a couple of loaves and a couple of fish. And Jesus proceeds to bless this and begin to break it up into pieces and sort of send it around through the crowds so that everybody might have what they need to have something to eat. And
Hmm.
lo and behold, when the baskets that they have broken and blessed come back, there's multitudes left over and everyone has
Right.
been.
Right.
And I've heard interpretations of this story again as like Jesus using godly supernatural power to multiply things and then
Hmm.
turn what is small into something big and feed everyone. I've the one that is more compelling to me is that Jesus dares to trust God and people enough
Hmm.
that if he makes the bold move of saying, "Come and you will be fed," that it unlocks something within people, that they're all of a sudden willing in some way to say either, "Oh, you can skip me, I've had enough," or, "Oh, you know what, I've got a little extra too, let me add." In some way, somehow, that's the miracle to me, is that people's hearts are opened when they were selfish before and they're
Yeah.
able to share.
It would be miraculous, pardon the pun, if 5,000 people all went out to this desert place to listen to this preacher. And the only one out of those 5,000 people that had the foresight to bring along a little something to eat happened to be a little boy. Uh, None of the adults were smart enough to do that, just this one little boy. Uh, so I have heard a plausible interpretation. Uh, if the story really happened. Now, here's the thing we've got to remember. Well, if it did, it happened twice because Luke tells it twice. Once 5,000, once 3,000. But uh, that that I've heard the interpretation that the little boy came forward, being kind of childlike faith. Uh, Here you can, I've got this here, and so Jesus, thank God for that, and that it did, as you said, sort of a trusting God and trusting people. That then there were other people there that, well, it turned out they had a little something under their cloak as well. And, it's like, well, okay, yeah, I've got here, I'll share too. And I'll share too. And then everybody started sharing. And as it turned out, there was enough. In fact, more than enough, because the story ends with 12 baskets full of leftovers, which they gathered. And as a kid, it was impressed upon me. They did not let that food go to waste, which maybe that was part of the meaning of the story, part of the meaning of the story. There's so much packed into scripture, that's what I'm saying. There's so much packed in there. Maybe that it was if it happened, an example of just getting people to trust that they didn't have to hoard and hold on to their little bit. That if we all share, God sees to it that God has put enough here on this earth if we are willing to share. And that I believe to be true. That's what true abundance is, not having more than enough, but everyone having enough. So,
Yeah.
so I think we're on a similar page, at least on that.
Yeah. Themes of abundance,
Yeah.
themes of faith, themes of,
Yeah.
for me, and we've talked about it at First Pres in our faith community a number of times. It's sort of you take the next right step, and
Mm-hmm.
then God does God's part, right? That's the
Right.
part we have faith in, that God does God's part, and that there is in fact enough.
Right. And that also takes us back to the water to wine. Do whatever he says do. Just take the next right step. Do the next, lead by the light that you have thus far, or walk by the light that you have thus far, and then you'll have more light as you do. In both of those stories, there's the just do what Jesus said do, and it there was enough,
Mm-hmm.
because both those stories were about scarcity.
Yeah, and your
Mm.
analogy of sort of walk by the light that you have so far is such a gracious and gentle invitation to let it be okay for people to understand this in whatever way they understand it now. I mean,
Absolutely.
there is a call to it if you think of it in a very literal terms. There's a call to it if you think of it in very figurative terms. And there's even, and we won't go too far into this, but there's even a lot of symbolic pieces to this that would have made sense to Jesus's original community. I mean, that there's
Yeah.
12 baskets left over, and there's 12 tribes of Jerusalem, that there's, all these numeric and sort of calling back to the faith tradition, and I think that's important too, because Jesus talks about, I didn't come to blow it all up, y'all. I didn't come to, that's not a direct quote, but I didn't come to destroy the law. I came to fulfill the law. So it's
Fulfill
not.
the best wine, not that the other was no good, but the best wine to fulfill. Right. And yeah, I mean, you have the food is such an important, obviously, but I mean, in scripture, food is very important. Um, the the 40 years that the children of Israel were in the wilderness, and every day there was the manna, and so Jesus is sort of providing the manna in that story for the people.
Yeah, and echoed in the 40 days in the wilderness, right? Which is so
Yeah,
appropriate for the season of Lent here too, where Jesus didn't have anything to eat.
and I now it just kind of boom, light bulb just went on. Something I already knew, but a memory just fired in my head. The story also, at least in one of the Gospels, it says that Jesus took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it. Well, it's like, wait, those are the words about communion. Over and over, Scripture, the New Testament always describes take, bless, break, give, you know. And so, there is at least an echo of communion and the church's meal together in that story of the feeding of the 5,000.
Yeah. And what an invitation to take the next brave kind of bold
Right.
step into faith, into abundance. Um,
Mhm.
I think about the journey of First Pres as a church, and the bold move of sort of selling all the property and trying to figure out if there was a new and different way to be a community. And
Yeah.
as it's been revealed to me to this point, one of my favorite phrases, God is blessing that, and there is abundance. There has been enough for us to continue to go. But I also think about, you referenced the story of the manna in the children of Israel and escaping Pharaoh and wandering. And one part of that story that's always sort of struck me, they couldn't store it up. You could,
Right.
or,
Yeah.
or echoed in the Lord's Prayer to give us this day our daily bread. You couldn't store it up. You couldn't gather up enough that you were going to feed everybody for several days or a week or whatever. You could eat what was good today, and and then you had to trust. Then you had to
It could not be hoarded. It was impossible to hoard. And I think hoarding is and I'm guilty too of hoarding. Hoarding is a problem in our society in particular, of just never trusting, always. And where does hoarding start and being prudent end? I don't know. I guess that's the problem. But anyway,
Well, and I find it interesting too, just to pull at that thread a little bit more, that you know many of the most powerful people in this country still identify as Christian, at least in word, if not in deed, right? We see that it still gets called a Christian nation by and
absolutely,
large.
absolutely.
But then also at the same time, and this is the part that's so ironic to me and just borderline ridiculous, is that it's also how much you have, how much you've hoarded, is an indicator of your blessedness.
Hmm.
And it's like, now wait a second, where did we get that? Because in each of these stories that we've been highlighting, whether it's the children of Israel or whether it's what we're learning through Jesus's parables, what we're learning through Jesus's miracles, is that it's not about hoarding and then showing and going, look how much I have, look how good I am. This must be an indicator that God loves me.
Right,
And
right,
the other unspoken part of that, if you don't have as much as me, it must be an indicator that you're not as good as me, or God doesn't love you as much as loves me.
right,
When what we're told over and over again in these stories is that it's nearly the exact opposite of that.
right. Hmm. Yeah. In the well, I was originally a United Methodist minister, and not when I was ordained, but like in the early 1900s, late 18, back historically, in that particular denomination, one of the uh, parts of the vow for a minister was that he, as it would have been at that time, would avoid the hoarding of wealth.
Hmm.
The hoarding of wealth was considered a sin. Uh, you know, we've things have changed a lot since then.
Yeah, that is not going to be a popular teaching.
No, 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 not at all. And I mean, again, it's like, whoa, well, and the first thing that even I want to do is say, well, how much is too much? How much? When do you start hoarding? How much? When is it? When is? when is it wealth and not just being prudent and making your family comfortable.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you that that's something that has shifted for me dramatically in the last year and a half as we've had folks that are impoverished and experiencing homelessness as members of our community consistently. And I've
Mm-hmm.
gotten to know some of these folks, and one of my friends there had told me he lives off about $80 a month. He's like, I got enough to eat. I got a place to sleep. It's a tent, but it's a place. And he's like, and you know what? Basically, I'm a lot freer than you. And I'm just, boy,
Yeah,
as I submitted to our session of elders last year a request for an increase for cost of living expenses and these things, and I'm going, wow, what a contrast
yeah,
between what not having enough means to me and what not having enough means to that individual.
right. Yeah,
Mm,
it's very easy to quit owning your stuff and for your stuff to start owning you.
yeah.
Yeah,
And yet we do that in the face of, in this, going back to this story, little boy with a couple loaves and
yeah.
fish, and that's about it.
Exactly. Yeah, he gave everything. In a sense, he was like the widow with her mite. That Jesus said, "Well, these other people gave out of their abundance. She gave everything she had to give," and that's what that little boy did. He gave everything.
And
And
one of the things I appreciate about the way you're talking about this, Steve, too, is that you're always looking for the self application. And that's another place I think I often hear folks kind of get tripped up, is that instead of seeing it as a self application, they start to say, well, this is what you ought to do. This is what you ought
right,
to do.
and it become well, and we've turned some. We Protestants have messed up in one way in that we have made it so much about belief and not action,
Mm.
because we're so careful to say, no, you don't earn God's favor, which you don't. It's grace. But we've made it so much about belief that then, like, even our approach to the Bible is it's like, oh, it doesn't matter if I'm not really living it, but I believe everything in it.
It's a mental exercise instead of a
Exactly.
way to live.
Exactly. And you got to believe everything in it. Well, okay, you won't live everything in it, but you got to believe it. Whoa, 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 whoa. What? You see, that's really, that's a messed up approach to faith, in
Yeah,
my opinion.
I agree. Well, I want to real quick just note that it looks like Rick and Holly have joined us. So if you guys end up with a question or a thought here, please don't hesitate to sort of jump in, wave at us, unmute, whatever. But I wanted to do a little conversation about some of the healing. So we started off talking a little bit
Mm,
about exorcism, but
mm,
there's a number of places in the scriptures where Jesus heals a hemorrhaging woman, where
yeah.
Jesus heals blindness, and
Hmm.
even as far as people who are sick or dying or even dead in some scenarios that Jesus is supposed to have healed.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm so curious about that as I think about once again how to what might be sort of more literal truth about that, what might be that metaphorical take the lesson kind of truth about that, and how important is it becomes an important question as we think about that. But particularly the one that stands out to me is a fellow named Bartimaeus. I'm sure you remember
Hmm.
about Bartimaeus, and he's shouting
Hmm.
out to Jesus at this point in Jesus's career, if you will. There's a lot of followers, a lot of people waving at him, yelling at him, wanting his attention. This blind fella has been blind since birth, gets Jesus' attention despite the disciples protesting, which they so often did when people wanted Jesus'
I know.
attention. But
Yeah, don't bother him. Don't bother him. Leave him alone.
yeah, and Jesus heals Bartimaeus, and it's been pulled out for me that, look, Bartimaeus's blindness was not just his affliction; it was also his job. It was also his career. I mean, in part because he was blind, there was not a lot else he could do to earn income except to beg. And if he's blind since birth, that's all he's ever known.
So we know to do. Yeah.
So, what a profound act of faith. I mean, today, you just think, of course, you'd want to see if you're blind. What a profound act of faith to restore sight, but that also removes everything you've always known.
Hmm. Hmm. Good point.
Which
Uh,
that is terrifying.
there's another, and I'm not going away from Bartimaeus. I'm
And
tagging this with adding, tacking this on. There's another parable. There's another miracle, rather, healing story in which Jesus says to the person, "Do you want to be made whole?" Just like, what? You mean somebody wouldn't? Uh, exactly. Uh, Sometimes it becomes so much a part. What is our illness? And by that, I don't necessarily mean physical illness, but things become so much a part of our identity that we don't really even want to be healed of it, you know. And oh, it's just the way I am, you know. Yeah, okay, uh, but wouldn't it be good if you ask God to help you work on that? Uh, the uh, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, being blind was part of who he was, part of his identity, because he didn't know how to do any job at all. He had never been trained to do anything. He was a grown-up man who had been given no job skills except begging, and now he couldn't even do that.
yeah.
Uh, and that's a great insight that somehow I hadn't thought about before.
Well, and
Uh,
Brene Brown's learning to walk in the dark. Some of what she talks about is the experiences of folks who are blind, and there's even places where you can go, like do dining in the dark, or have a limited experience of what it might be like to be unable to see.
right.
One story she tells in particular is a woman who is blind from birth, and who there's this new surgery, and she is able to see again after this. Now, in this particular woman's story, she is so overwhelmed
Mm-hmm.
by bright, by light, by color, and further feels like it deadens some of her other senses that have become so finely tuned in her blindness, that the vast majority of the time the woman chooses to put a blindfold on
Oh, wow. Yeah.
because she's so overstimulated. And, who knows how that progresses and changes over time. But to your point, and without even saying, oh, that's right or that's wrong,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
our whatever our afflictions, whether they're illnesses or not, whatever mechanisms and coping skills and tools and various things we've adopted in order to move and function and breathe and work through this world,
Right.
become so often become so much a part of our identity, that to be healed, to be transformed, is a terrifying concept. I think that's why the 12 steps start with powerless and unmanageable.
Right. Right. Exactly. I think you're right. It is a terrifying thing because now you are more responsible than you were before uh, for whatever. If you no longer have that excuse available,
Mhm.
uh, and I'm not speaking in particular about blindness. Again, as you say, all kinds of uh, afflictions that we may have, and the idea of being not having that excuse, not having that to blame for our
Mhm.
failings.
Mhm.
Uh, it can be very scary. Do you really even want to be made whole or to be made well, however Jesus worded it? Yeah.
And the number of times I've had conversations with folks who are attempting to walk a path of spiritual growth, that at some point say, what have I done? I wish I could just sort of go back to sleep. I wish I
Yeah.
could just not. But the
Yeah.
reality is, we have to be a certain amount of uncomfortable to even pursue any kind of healing, growth, transformation, or change.
Right. Right.
And if we get into that spot where we're willing to start taking a step toward, then we could never be satisfied again. I don't believe with where we were. I think it's always going to kind of provoke us toward some kind of healing, at least through the conversations that I've had with folks, that it's like, would you really go to back to the unknowing? You know too much. Would you really go back to the unknowing? And it's like, nah, I'd find another way.
Yeah. 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 I my late wife Phyllis worked with visually impaired and blind people as a vocational rehabilitation counselor. So I got to know quite a few of them through her and through her association with the National Federation of the Blind. And I knew one fellow who, and I don't think it was original with him. I think he had picked it up somewhere else. Referred to the rest of us, meaning those of us that see reasonably well, as light dependent.
Ooh,
Light dependent. See, he wasn't light dependent.
wow.
And yeah, uh, that's to me that's just something interesting to let it sort of rattle around in your head a little bit. I mean, yeah, well, yeah, we are light dependent, all of us, including him. One kind of light, but yeah, it can be what we think of as a disability is also an ability
Mm.
and can be an ability. And what we think of as an ability is in some ways a disability because I depend on light. You put me in darkness, all of a sudden I'm the one that can't function very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
I, I literally was one night took a bookcase I was giving to a blind friend, and it was nighttime, and so I go into the bedroom to put the shelves back, and I go to the light switch, and of course he has no light bulbs.
Right.
Why would he have light bulbs in his apartment? And so it's like, it was the first time it ever even occurred to me that blind people don't have light bulbs in their apartments, or if they do, they don't replace them when they go out. Uh, I was the one who was at the disability rather than him.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Oh wow, that one we could unpack for quite a
yeah,
while. We've only got a
yeah.
few minutes left together. Well, I mean, you can call me anytime, Steve, but for the purposes of this, so I want to circle back to that question of kind of how important is it? So in one of our episodes, we were talking a little bit about the difference between a brick wall theology and sort of a trampoline spring theology. Now, the brick wall theology, with the bricks carefully balanced on each one, you pull out a brick and the wall
Hmm.
tumbles.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
if you have a trampoline spring type theology, you can take out a spring and the trampoline still works. You can put it back, take out a different spring. You can take out a couple
Hmm.
springs and it still works.
Hmm.
Um, and as I think about the how important is it to understand these miracles as literal or not literal or purely one or the other,
Hmm.
how important is it to your
Yeah.
theology?
I've heard people use the argument many times, and I'm sure there was a time in my life I would have used the argument. But to me, it's simply looking for an argument, looking for a rationalization. But I've heard the argument, well, if I couldn't believe all of it, I couldn't believe any of it. How would I know? How would I be able to trust any of it? Well, let's think about that a minute. Were your parents always 100% right about everything? Everything they ever told you from birth until now? Never mistaken? Never wrong about anything? I doubt it. Do you still trust them? Well, they're good parents, yeah. You're going to trust them still. So the logic of, oh no, it's all or nothing, as we said at the outset, that all or nothing logic doesn't actually stand up very well, I don't think. Uh, do I trust that every single thing that I read in a textbook is definitely true? Well, often no, new knowledge comes to light and it turns out no, that was actually not true. Does that mean none of the other stuff was true either? No, of course it doesn't mean that. So this all or nothing with the Bible, it's almost like people trying to come up with a reason why you should have to believe everything, a rationale to support a theology. But I just do I believe it completely? Well, depends on what you mean. I believe it for what it's meant to be? I put my trust in it for what it's meant to be. I don't think it was ever meant to be a history book or a science manual. Uh, and I know that in the faith tradition I came from, it was the sufficient rule and guide in matters of faith and practice. In matters of faith and practice, but not necessarily, we never said in matters of any subject about which it might could be considered to be speaking, you know, matters of faith and practice.
And it occurs to me too, at least in my one humble life of
Mm-hmm.
experience, is that the truest truths always have contradiction in them, always have paradox in them. And for me, I don't need another textbook.
Right.
I don't need another history book. I don't need another math book or equation. What I do need and what I'll always need and what I'll always want more of is love.
Mm-hmm.
That's what
Mm-hmm.
this particular story, this particular book is about. Then the sort of historical factuality, the scientific accuracy isn't important. Because I don't know much, but I know love has very little to do with scientific accuracy and
Right.
very little to do with historical facts.
Right.
That there is something bigger and greater and more important to be revealed if we'll let it.
Yeah.
You know, in that piece about transformation that we danced with a bit, I think these stories invite us into the possibility of transformation. And it's up to us whether we accept, receive, say yes, say no, reject, deny,
Yeah.
enjoy, or not. You know, and in the Presbyterian tradition, we talk about that the chief end of humanity is to love God and enjoy God forever. And if the goal is love and enjoyment, I don't need this to be factual
Right. Right. Right.
in the traditional sense. I need it to be true.
No, right. You're right. Right. Truth and factuality are two different things, you're saying, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sounds right to me. Boy, Steve,
Yeah.
it's just good to see you and get to talk to you.
You too. You too.
And Rick and Holly, I'm glad you tuned in. And anybody else who happens to be watching on Facebook or YouTube or any of those places, feel free to drop a comment with your thoughts, ideas, suggestions, questions, and we'll do our very best to circle back and address them in some fashion.
Thanks for the invite, by the way. I enjoyed it.
I'll I'll make one comment. We're sitting at the kitchen counter and we're making dinner and so forth. So video of us is not helpful. But I'll just say one thing, and that is that um, the conversation between you two was so enlightening, and I really am grateful. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the insights, or I should say, we do. I really appreciate the thought. I really appreciate the time that you've devoted in your respective lives to dig into this and to make sense of it and then share your journey with us. Share your journey, your path, what you've learned, what you've grown into. Uh, we are so much richer for that and for this conversation. And I am truly blessed and thank you both. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you. I want to just a quick response that the word journey is so perfect because it is a journey. It's not like when I was in seminary, they gave me all the right answers, and ever since then, I've believed exactly the same thing. No, I'm still on that journey. And how much I do and don't believe certain things tends to vary. Uh, and that's fine. It's a journey. And I'm trying to take the next right step.
God's grace and love has room for all of that, thank goodness.
Exactly.
Well,
Mhm.
friends, I hope you'll come back for Jesus 101 again and keep an eye on your calendars. Our next episode will be on April 14th at 5:30 at this same Zoom link, and we'll be talking about the teachings and the actions of Christ. So, how we understand how Jesus taught and moved through the world and why that's important and how that helps us understand who this rabble-rousing rabbi from all these years ago mattered then and matters now. And
Mhm.
thanks again, guys, for being here. And we'll talk to you and see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Good night.